Unsafe landing alarm. Plane crashes into slope. Investigation agency enters.
We have a belly landing confirmed.
The familiar flight. The Las Vegas-Burbank route was a familiar air corridor to many flight crews in the southwestern U.S. Everyone knew the terrain, the winds, and the operational rhythm of these two busy airports. Therefore, many often viewed this journey as an easy shift. A straightforward takeoff, a short flight, a quick landing with little need for calculation. But that day, things began to deviate from the familiar trajectory. In Las Vegas, the air over the runway surface was stirred up by unpredictable weather patches. The warning systems in the area continuously alerted to unstable changes, forcing many flights to adjust their schedules. Flight 1455 also fell into that delay. The nearly 2-hour postponement not only pressured the operational plan but also pushed the crew into the approach phase during an unusual time slot, where air traffic density at Burbank often peaked and coordination decisions became more sensitive than usual. Major incidents often don't start with one clear mistake, but from a cumulative buildup of small factors. A bit of complacency, a bit of schedule disruption, plus unstable weather conditions. When these pieces overlap, they create a silent rule that many in the profession call the slide toward risk. No one deliberately enters it, but once you step in, it's very difficult to pull out in time. This once familiar flight was, thus, no longer a simple journey. It ushered in a chain of events that investigators later spent months reviewing to realize. Things didn't happen naturally. It started the moment the crew left Las Vegas on a day that seemed normal, but was actually placing invisible pressure on the entire subsequent flight.
Delta 45,
Experienced pilots, but unusual flight conditions. The captain possessed over 11,000 flight hours. That number didn't come naturally. It was the result of thousands of takeoffs and landings, long nights in the dark sky, and every kind of situation that only a seasoned professional would have experienced. The first officer that day had served in a military environment, a background that helped him with discipline and quick reflexes. On paper, this was a crew any airline would want. But experience, no matter how vast, has to accept a familiar reality. Weather doesn't follow human logic. In Las Vegas, sudden thunderstorm patches appeared, causing warning systems in the area to constantly alert to potential wind shear. Those signals were enough to make any experienced person reevaluate every step. Wind shear near the ground is always a double-edged sword in the industry. It makes many pilots take a step back and carefully consider every decision. The flight was held on the ground for nearly 2 hours. This delay didn't just disrupt the crew's work rhythm, but also put them in an uncomfortable situation. Approaching Burbank at a time of denser traffic and when coordination decisions were often compressed due to traffic flow pressure. Outsiders often think that everything is easy for experienced pilots, but the reality is the opposite. When conditions are unfavorable, extensive experience sometimes becomes a burden of responsibility, forcing them to be confident enough but not allowed to be complacent. At that moment, the crew did nothing wrong. They were simply entering a day where small fragments, weather, schedule, ground pressure, began to align in a way no one wanted. The abnormally heavy aircraft and compressed schedule. As the 737-300 prepared to leave Las Vegas, the crew faced another variable. The aircraft was loaded with over 3,000 pounds of extra reserve fuel, in case they had to turn back due to weather preventing the approach to Burbank. This was a correct, by-the-book decision, but it placed the aircraft in a weight region close to the maximum threshold for a standard landing. In flight engineering, weight is no small matter. A heavier aircraft requires higher speed, a longer distance, and a higher degree of precision when nearing the runway. The problem wasn't just in the fuel number. Because the flight was held for nearly 2 hours, the entire crew schedule was compressed like a stretched string. As the previous aircraft vacated the gate, they had to move in immediately to complete ground procedures in less time than usual. Every step was still by the book, but the processing speed was forced to be quick, so fast that there wasn't much room to re-review every small detail. With hundreds of similar situations daily in the aviation industry, no one did anything wrong, but the accelerated work pace created an environment where it was easy to miss small signals. The industry always reminds itself that schedule pressure cannot enter the cockpit, But the reality is that operational life doesn't always adhere to that advice as the aircraft proceeded toward Burbank. The high weight and compressed schedule inadvertently became two new variables, silent factors trailing the crew, demanding that they trim and adjust everything more meticulously than they were used to. And it was precisely these seemingly simple details, a little extra fuel, a delay of a few dozen minutes, rushing ground procedures, that sometimes became the foundation for small deviations, enough to make an already difficult day a few degrees more complicated. The approach to Burbank. As the 737 continued to drift south toward California, the pressure ramped up another layer, and this time it came from the ground. Burbank is not a fly-in-and-it's-done type of airport. It is tightly locked in between high hills, terrain features that any flight crew must respect. In this area, a flight path off by half a beat is enough to turn all calculations into a burden. Runway 08 is the only runway equipped with ILS, Instrument Landing System, the straightforward guidance tool that all pilots want to rely on when approaching in a confined environment. Runway 26 is almost always out of the game. Its approach path is blocked by hills and mountains, making it a reluctant choice, used only when no other option remains. Initially, the crew was vectored toward runway 33, an entry point favored by the wind, requiring less maneuvering. Everything was proceeding as expected. The plane was heavy, time was tight, but the approach path was clear. Just a few minutes later, ATC called back, changing the plan, requesting a switch to ILS 08. Changing direction this late is not uncommon, but in an area like Burbank, it made the entire sequence of tasks more crowded. The crew was forced to maneuver quickly, adjusting speed, altitude, and distance, all within an already cramped space due to the surrounding hills. From the aviation industry's perspective, such last-minute changes do not inherently create risk, but they bundle small factors into a progressively more difficult scenario. Complex terrain, only one ILS path, and a late approach change request. All of this meant the already pressured flight now had to walk the tightrope with absolute precision. This was the point where small deviations, if uncontrolled, could ignite a chain of events no one wanted to see. Late vector. By this stage, the 737 was not only facing the cramped terrain of Burbank, but also had to deal with another issue coming from the air traffic control system itself. ATC that day was trying to slot the flight between two streams of aircraft that were nose-to-tail heading toward the area. This sounds simple, but in reality, it's like trying to pull a heavy truck into a narrow gap between two moving lines of cars. Everything must be fast, precise, and not off by half a beat. ATC cleared Flight 1455 to turn onto the final approach path only about 8 nautical miles from the runway threshold, which is nearly 6 nautical miles shorter than the standard. To non-professionals, this distance might seem insignificant, but at the speed being maintained, that distance was too little for the aircraft to have enough time to reduce altitude, reduce speed, and capture the ideal ILS glide slope. In short, the crew was pushed into a situation where they had to climb down the stairs when already standing right next to the final step. TO make matters worse. ATC also forgot to remove the 230-knot speed restriction they had applied to the aircraft earlier. This meant the 737 had to continue carrying more momentum than necessary when entering the final segment, exactly when they needed to slow down the most. A small decision forgotten, but it made the crew's entire sequence of tasks unstable. Air traffic controllers often have to balance dozens of aircraft simultaneously, but that very rush can eliminate the breathing room an aircraft needs for a safe approach. When the vector was issued too late, too close, and the speed restriction was not removed, the crew was virtually forced to maneuver in a space too narrow to do everything according to standard. And from here, the 737 entered a phase where any mistake, no matter how small, could become the breaking point for the entire flight. Too fast, too high, too heavy. When Flight 1455 was shoved into the final approach in an unprepared state, all critical parameters for a stable approach had begun to deviate from the standard path. The 737 was descending at a speed of 230 knots, much higher than necessary for this phase, while the weight was still near the maximum limit for landing. Professionals understand, combining high speed, high weight, and a short approach distance is like trying to slam the brakes on a truck going downhill. Theoretically, it's possible, but in reality, it's extremely risky. The crew had to reduce nearly 100 knots in just a few miles of flight, a task that any training manual would consider exceeding safety limits. With the distance shortened, the 737 no longer had enough time to simultaneously reduce speed, bring the aircraft down to the correct glide slope, and stabilize the approach angle. Everything happened rapidly while the clock was ticking and the distance to the runway was shrinking. The most confusing thing, and the core of the problem, was that the crew did not request more distance or suggest a go-around to ATC. Just a simple request would have been enough to buy them the airspace to manage everything. But they continued to descend, trying to fit the speed into the overly narrow space that ATC had set earlier. Pilots, when caught up in the rushed pace of ATC, easily flow along with the workflow and forget that they always have the right to request more space. And when the aircraft is fast, high, and heavy, just missing one small opportunity to exit the situation, the entire approach will slide out of the safety zone. Flight 1455 was now right on that edge, and its trajectory indicated what was waiting ahead. The Southwest Airlines Flight 1455 aircraft overshot the runway, causing severe structural damage to the aircraft when it impacted an embankment beyond the runway. However, luckily, there were no casualties in the incident. All passengers and crew were safe. System failure. Incidents like Flight 1455 rarely originate from a single decision. They are usually the result of multiple layers of protection being gradually eroded, until finally, no layer remains strong enough to keep the aircraft within the safe zone. And here, three crucial links: air traffic control, the company culture, and the crew's choices interlocked in the worst possible way. First, ATC created an unmanageable context. A late vector, too short a distance, speed held at a high level, all put together like a time-constrained problem. But the crew could have broken this chain of events with just one word: unable. That was their right, and a phrase emphasized in any practical training material. Yet, it was not uttered. The rest came from the company culture at the time, a tendency to get it done during rushed approaches. Not because the pilots lacked competence, but because years of operating in a high-frequency flight environment had inadvertently formed a habit of trying to maintain the pace. When ATC issued a difficult instruction, they chose to go along rather than request more space, even though all parameters indicated the situation was no longer ideal. Finally, the crew continued to try to fit the 737 onto the glide path in conditions that no longer met stability standards. No layer of protection remained intact. ATC gave suboptimal instructions, company culture created a mindset of maintaining pace, and the crew failed to stop at the right moment. When these three factors accumulated, the risk was no longer just on paper. It became a real trajectory, leading the aircraft straight to a risk that no one managed to pull back from.